Good morning and welcome. This morning we have a very interesting program. We're going to be talking about the death of Ayman al-Zawahiri and the implications of that for the US, the region, and for the United States counterterrorism strategy. I'm especially delighted because we have three former CIA officers here today as well. And for CIA officers, I think this news was particularly personal. Al-Zawahiri, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. We chased Zawahiri for many, many years, and we kept killing the number 3 in al-Qaeda, capturing and or killing the number 3 in al-Qaeda, but it took this long to get the number 2. And so it's personal, not only because of that, but also because of the attack which resulted in the deaths of 7 CIA officers at Camp Chapman and Coast in December 2009. We might say a few words about that too this morning. We have two exceptionally knowledgeable officers here this morning, panelists and experts to talk about this. The first is Bruce Riedel, who is a senior fellow and director of the Brookings Intelligence Project, which is part of the Brookings Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence. He's also a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy. He served for 30 years at the CIA and on the National Security Council, and as a senior advisor on South Asia and the Middle East to 4 presidents of the United States. We also have with us this morning Phil Wojciechowski, who is one of our newest FPRI senior fellows. He's also a 2022 Templeton Fellow at FPRI. He was a former military case officer who had a 31-year career in the Directorate of Operations of the CIA. He was a member of the first CIA team that went into Afghanistan in 2001. He served on a 3-year assignment at the NSC staff as a director for intelligence and covert action programs. He also had a 30-year Marine Corps career, some of that concurrent with his time at the CIA as an infantry officer, including mobilizations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Without further ado, we'll go to our actual program. Before I do that, just a couple notes. One is start putting your questions in the Q&A box. We'll go to those questions about halfway through. We also have some links in our chat to some maps of the region, also to an article just published by one of our senior fellows, Colin Clark, on the implications of the death of al-Zawahiri. And we also have a link to Bruce's book on al-Qaeda. So we'll open, and I'll let each of you say a few remarks about this whole occurrence and what it means. Bruce, why don't you take it away first?
Certainly, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Ayman al-Zawahiri is an Egyptian. He was trained as a doctor. He comes from a quite illustrious family. Among his fathers and grandfathers, etc., was Sheikh of Al-Azhar, the Islamic University in Cairo, and some important ambassadors. He turned to the jihad very early in life. He began jihadist activities at 15. In 1981, he was involved on the periphery of the plot to successfully assassinate Anwar Sadat. He was arrested in the purge that followed and became the spokesman for those in prison. When he was released, he began a long career of basically running from the law. He literally ran almost around the world, including a trip to the United States, I should say, in 1993. He was many things in al-Qaeda. One of the things he was one of the liaisons, chief liaisons to the Taliban in Afghanistan. So it's no surprise that he was found in basically a safe house of the Taliban belonging to the Haqqani network. But his most important role in al-Qaeda was as its chief ideologist. Ayman al-Zawahiri was a prolific writer. He also loved to do videos in which he spoke at length. When I say prolific, I should also say he could be pedantic. His writing can also be very, very hard to follow in places. He obviously needed but never had a good editor. With that said, let me say a few words about what was his message, because I think many Americans don't really know what the ideology of al-Qaeda is. His message was fairly simple. The Islamic world is under attack today. It's being attacked by America, it's being attacked by Russia, it's being attacked by China, by India. What it needs is power. And that's what al-Qaeda is all about, reacquiring power for the Muslim world. In Zawahiri's thinking, the Islamic world had that power up until a century ago. For 4 centuries, the Ottoman Empire provided that power that protected the Islamic world. In this sense, Ayman al-Zawahiri is one of the last Ottomanists. He wants to recreate a caliphate like the Ottomans. He sees the downfall of the Ottoman Empire in 1919 as beginning to usher in the misery and chaos that the Islamic world lives in today, divided into a host of petty states, all of whom are run by tyrants who are basically puppets of the United States. Therein, he introduced this second and very, very important concept, that the real duty of the jihad is to attack the far enemy, that is the United States, that it is the far enemy that manipulates the so-called close enemy, the ones like Jordan or Saudi Arabia, or above all, Israel. Israel is the essence, the focus point of much of Zawahiri's statements. He regards the creation of Israel as the greatest catastrophe that ever overtook the Islamic world, because it physically divides Islamic Asia from Islamic Africa. The solution is to attack the far enemy and to goad the far enemy into quagmires like Afghanistan and like Iraq. He wanted the United States to invade Afghanistan in 2001. He was thrilled that we invaded Iraq. But of course, those wars did not turn out entirely as al-Qaeda suspected they would. It turned out that al-Qaeda may have dragged us into quagmires, but it also found out that we had devastating capacity to move against al-Qaeda. One last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Phil. There's one player missing so far in this whole story, and that's the role of Pakistan. Pakistan was and has been for decades the patron of the Haqqani network of the Taliban. The Haqqani network is the part of the Taliban that the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, has always been closest to. So there's a mystery here. What did the Pakistanis know? Who did they tell, if anybody? Did they tell the United States anything? We haven't heard anything from the administration on that, but I can tell you in Pakistan, there is intense speculation going on as to what the role of the Pakistani army, which runs the foreign policy of the country, was in this whole affair. Let me stop there.
Phil?
Well, thanks, Raleigh. First off, before I get into my comments, I'd like to offer congratulations to our colleagues in the intelligence community for such an excellent and impactful operation under, as usual, the very difficult circumstances it has to operate in order to protect our nation. I'd like to make this very clear, though, at the beginning. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of the al-Qaeda terrorist organization responsible for 9/11 and many other attacks against this country and its interests, was killed not in some cave in a remote section of Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas, but in downtown Kabul in a safe house belonging to Sirajeen Haqqani, who's the first deputy leader of the Taliban and Afghanistan's Minister of Interior. This should put to end forever the belief that the Taliban would not allow the al-Qaeda to come back into the country if it ever regained power. I had listened to that for years. My response was always, oh, and the Taliban would never lie. Hopefully we can now understand the threat that faces us in Afghanistan. the threat is coming both from al-Qaeda and several other terrorist organizations that either wholly or their affiliates are found in Afghanistan. ISIS, of course, the Islamic State Khorasan province being the next one, with al-Qaeda, have global jihadi aspirations. And there are numerous others with regional jihadi aspirations in Pakistan, Central Asia, Kashmir, to name a few areas. The next point I'd like to make is that while this was an excellent operation, we should not be lulled into a false sense of security that the sources and methods that led to this success can be replicated to eliminate or disrupt all of the various other threats that can come to us from Afghanistan. Without getting into specifics into sources and methods, which should be jealously protected, as the three of us know. For the public, for the viewers of this podcast should understand, is that the actual strike, when it is done in a counterterrorism operation, represents less than 0.1% of that actual counterterrorism operation. The other 99.9% is a painstaking all-source intelligence collection operation, followed by equally painstaking analysis and then surveillance to determine if we have the proper target and if we can strike the proper target. And as you all know, that involved in the collection of this intelligence, it will also collect ambiguous, contradictory, and incomplete elements of information that have to be debated and analyzed very carefully before it can be turned into real intelligence. And then with the proper surveillance, which is very difficult to do because Afghanistan is a denied area. It's probably one of the world's most denied areas, which highlights again the great success our intelligence community just had. We have to make sure that we meet these standards, the high standards we have set for ourselves as a nation in counterterrorism operation regarding the identity of our target and the possibility of collateral damage when conducting a counterterrorism strike. So these are the elements that really go into a counterterrorism operation. So I say it's such a success for our intelligence community. However, there are many, many threats, not just from al-Qaeda, but for Islamic State Khorasan province, Lashkar-e-Taiba, the East Turkestan Islamic movement, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, and many others that reside in Afghanistan and that have to be acknowledged. And I realize that is not right now a topic that Washington wants to be engaged in. After the events of the past year, the consensus in the policy community is we'd like to forget about Afghanistan, believe that with one strike, hopefully this means that the problem is over. If only that was so. Afghanistan remains a threat to our national security, not as great as it was 2 decades ago, thanks to 2 decades of great sacrifices in counterterrorism work, but still a threat that emanates because the al-Qaeda, as we see, still exists. As Bruce was mentioning, its purpose for existing has not changed. And part of that purpose for existing is to attack us for its own political goals. So I'll kind of end there with my introductory remarks. Again, it was a great operation, but it is just part of a continuing effort to protect ourselves and not the end.
Thanks, Phil. Bruce, how significant is al-Zawahiri's death is for the U.S. and for the threat against us? And what really is the impact of his death? Was he still a player or not?
He was very much still a player. According to the administration, he was in the process of preparing yet more videos while he was staying in this safe house in Kabul. It's much easier to prepare a video and much, much easier to distribute it if you're in a major urban area with modern communication systems rather than hiding out in a cave somewhere. So the fact that he had come back to Kabul, I think, is one indicator that he felt very confident he was safe there, but also that he felt that he could operate from there. There's also a hugely symbolic role here. This is a man who literally we have been seeking to find since the East Africa bombings in 1998. It's taken a better part of a quarter of a century. But as they say, you can run, but you cannot hide. You can hide for a while, but in this case, it turned out he couldn't hide indefinitely. And I think that's a hugely important message that the United States needs to get out, and which I think President Biden rightly pointed to when he made the White House announcement.
Phil, anything to add to that?
No, I think Bruce has put it very succinctly of what the significance of this is, and I'm nothing more to add to that.
One of the things we always worry, and we worried about this with Osama bin Laden, does this even make him a greater figure of inspiration, a martyr, the fact that he's now been killed? Any risk of that? Either one of you?
Well, martyrdom is what the members of al-Qaeda say they aspire to. And certainly some of them do, suicide bombers. But I'm hard put to say that either Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri practiced the business of seeking martyrdom. They were not trying to blow something up when they were killed. So in that sense, yes, they'll definitely be made martyrs, but I'm not that worried about that.
Okay. Phil, can you talk a little bit about AQ today, al-Qaeda today, and whether we should still care about it, and how exactly does it fit into the landscape of terrorist groups?
Well, as we're all aware, al-Qaeda was the first of the major Islamist transnational groups that set its sights on not just on Israel or its own governments in the region, such as Egypt, but on the United States, as Bruce talked about, the far enemy strategy that was developed in al-Qaeda in the 1990s. And as we remember, it became a popular franchise, spreading out not just from Afghanistan, where it relocated to from Sudan, but into the Sahel, into the Arabian Peninsula, especially in Yemen, into parts of Pakistan and India as it tried, and affiliates that were associated with, like Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a Pakistani, and others, which are Pakistani proxy groups for the war in Kashmir, or the Islamic Movement of Nation, which has proven itself to be very, very capable. And again, we are one of its main targets. So I believe that this is one of the challenges that this event can pose to us, and why sustained pressure against the al-Qaeda, as well as the Islamic State and the Islamic State in Khorasan province in Afghanistan is necessary. Again, if the Islamic State, Khorasan province in Afghanistan, and the al-Qaeda and the Taliban reach an understanding, reach a modus vivendi, we now have an even more dangerous terrorist threat emitting from that country.
Thanks, Phil. Bruce and or Phil, do we have a good feel for just how entrenched the Taliban is in Afghanistan, or excuse me, the al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan? I mean, the fact that al-Zawahiri was there, I think is I found shocking, but maybe you didn't. But what can we say about their ability to operate pretty freely and what do we actually know?
Let me take a first stab at that. The United Nations has a task force that regularly reports on the status of al-Qaeda and its presence and activities in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And they have for years said that there continues to be a significant al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan and in the border areas of Pakistan along there. I think one of the big question marks for all of us a year ago, when the Afghan Republic collapsed, was how much more presence would al-Qaeda now be able to develop in Afghanistan? And I think we've had that question now partially answered, considerable more. As we said several times, he wasn't hiding in a cave. He wasn't in the boondocks somewhere. He was in the capital of Afghanistan in what I understand is a rather trendy upscale neighborhood. That shows that they're allowed to operate pretty openly. Will this change that at all? I'm skeptical. I don't think the Taliban has changed its spots. And in fact, I think this episode underscores that this is the same old Taliban we've been dealing with one important difference. For the last 20 years, there was pressure on them, pressure from us and pressure from the Afghan government and pressure from NATO. All of those are gone. The Taliban today controls Afghanistan far more thoroughly than it did in 2001 when the 9/11 attack occurred. In the 2001, there was a substantial opposition to the Taliban in Afghanistan. That's people we worked with, the Northern Alliance, Ahmed Shah Massoud's forces, Uzbeks. Those forces are now very much on the run. There's occasional rumors of operations by them against the Taliban, but nothing significant. The Taliban are more firmly entrenched than ever. And I think we now have to worry that al-Qaeda is going to be given more opportunity. And Phil is right. If we get a better, more sophisticated, more charismatic, more unifying leader, this could be a real serious tipping point in the wrong direction.
This prompts me to ask the question, does the international community care? Right now, there are a lot of things going on in the world between the pandemic and what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. Is there any kind of appetite among the international community or NATO to try to do something about what's going on in Afghanistan and in the United States? Any comment on that, either of you?
Well, Raleigh, I won't talk about the international community or NATO. Right now, their bandwidth, as you know, is covered with many other things. Yeah. But with this country, within our national security apparatus, there should be at least one portion of it that focuses on counterterrorism. That should be focused on this. It is focused, as we've seen in this last operation, but it's going to need some political will. What Bruce was talking about is absolutely correct about the relationship between the al-Qaeda and Taliban. It has been there from almost the very beginning. I would recommend for our viewers a very good book by an author, Charles Allen, not the Charles Allen we know from the intelligence community, but a British author called God's Terrorist. And it lays out very closely the symbiotic relationship between the Wahhabi community in Saudi Arabia and the Deobandi community in then British India and today Pakistan's tribal area, which spawned the Taliban. The ties, the theological ties, the philosophical ties between these two movements, the Wahhabi movement, which the al-Qaeda is based on, and the Deobandi movement that the Taliban is based on, have been close for almost 2 centuries. On a more practical level, modern day level, mid-level and high-level al-Qaeda and Taliban families have been intermarrying for 2 decades. There has never been any chance that the Taliban were ever going to throw out their own relatives from Afghanistan. And I'd also like to comment on something Bruce said about the pressure that we need to keep on, and the fact that we, in some ways, despite this success, this great success we have, that we are possibly even less capable, with fewer allies, I should say, fewer allies than we did on September 10th, 2001. Now, there are allies there, and it is basically the same people who helped us on September 26th, 2001, when the first CIA team landed there. These are the ethnic minorities in Afghanistan, primarily the Tajiks, but also the Hazara, Uzbeks, and others. The National Resistance Front, which is a successor of the Northern Alliance and is right now headed by the son, the oldest son of Ahmed Shah Massoud, his name is Ahmed Massoud, is right now first amongst equals in the anti-Taliban resistance, both because of the legacy of the Northern Alliance, Ahmed Massoud's obviously being the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, and the fact that it does, by some accounts, field at least 2,000 to 3,000 fighters in areas, in Tajik areas, as well as other resistance groups in Saripul province, led by Hazaras and Uzbeks, and other smaller groups that are operating in northern Afghanistan. They're not as capable as the Northern Alliance was around 1998, 1999, 2000, but there is still some core of resistance. And this, since we're unlikely to get many other allies in the region, this provides us at least a basis of some allies who can provide us further intelligence and also help us grow and expand our counterterrorism infrastructure in the region. Again, something I know people do not want to hear, to get back to your original question about will, but it is something that should be acknowledged and worked with, even on a low-key, behind-the-scenes manner, in order to have an infrastructure to be warned about what threats may be coming from Afghanistan for our own self-interest.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to start going to questions from the audience because we're accumulating quite a few of them. We have one for you, Bruce, regarding Pakistan. Do you think Pakistan might have tipped off the U.S. as part of our outreach to persuade the U.S. administration to back the IMF to support Pakistan, which is facing possible financial collapse?
Yes. As I said, the role of Pakistan in this is very important, very central. They are the Haqqani network's patron. There has been some speculation, interestingly, coming from within Pakistan, that the Shahbaz Sharif government may have given us some tips here, precisely because it needs economic support so badly. That this could have been a payoff for getting economics backing in the IMF and other places. Well, first of all, we haven't seen any sign of that. The Biden administration has adopted a policy towards Pakistan that can at best be called benign neglect. President Biden has never called the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and there have been two on his watch. Now, the first one, Imran Khan, was understandably anti-American, a conspiracy theorist. But the new one, Shahbaz Sharif, is about as close to being a moderate as you're going to get in Pakistan. So the fact that he hasn't embraced Sharif either, I think is a serious mistake, and one that the White House should rectify, whether or not the Pakistanis helped us with this mission or not. My own inclination is it's more likely they didn't. This is a huge embarrassment to the Taliban, and Pakistan is the country closest to the Taliban in the world. So in a sense, it's an embarrassment to them as well. If I could add one other thing, there's another ally somewhere out there who we haven't heard from. That drone did not fly from Nevada all the way to Afghanistan. It flowed from somewhere in the Middle East or Central Asia, somewhere or another. And whoever that place is, has proven to be a stalwart friend of the United States in allowing this mission to go forward. For understandable reasons, the administration is not putting out who that is, and I think we should leave it there. But they certainly stood up and helped us carry out an important mission. Very important mission.
Thanks. Phil, we have another question. How do you see al-Zawahiri's death as impacting the operational environment for different Islamic groups in Afghanistan and the greater South Asia region?
Well, again, unless it's followed up by followed-on counterterrorism measures against the groups, starting with al-Qaeda, but the other groups in the area, there's not much impact it can have. He will be replaced. And as I mentioned before, if his replacement is an even more capable and charismatic person who can unite instead of doing what Zawahiri did, which was divide, then we could have some sort of rapprochement between the al-Qaeda, Taliban on one side and the Islamic State Khorasan province on the other. So that is one possibility. It may not happen immediately, but we should not see the Taliban Islamic State Khorasan province split as immutable, just like many other, between the Soviet and Sino-Soviet split and even the Molotov-Ribbentrop treaty. Their history has shown that enemies can neither divide or unite depending on the circumstances and the needs. The second point I'd like to make is right now, the al-Qaeda is going to have to decide. There are, according to press reports, several different possible candidates. I should also mention, it seems that most all of them are already in Afghanistan to replace Ayman al-Zawahiri. And whoever they pick is going to have, that pick is going to have considerable influence in the direction of the al-Qaeda movement, but also probably overall the world, the jihadi movement, depending on how they approach the future of their operations.
Thanks, Phil. Bruce, we have a question on thoughts of a partnership between India and USA in the reduction of terror in Southwest Asia. I would expand that to talk about who are our other potential allies in the region, but India is the specific focus of this question.
US and India have very close security cooperation. This has not always been the case. Through most of the Cold War, we were not necessarily enemies, but we certainly weren't very close. But beginning in the Clinton administration, and then pursued on a bipartisan basis, the United States has moved closer to India. We do a great number of military training exercises with the Indians now. And we're united in a forum called the Quad, which is basically an anti-China forum, although all four members of the Quad deny vociferously that that's the purpose of it. But that is, of course, the purpose of it. India can be an important ally here. India was very favorable and supportive of the Afghan government that collapsed a year ago. We were always a little bit skittish about how much of an Indian presence we wanted to see in Afghanistan on the ground, because that would, to some degree, encourage conspiracy theories that this was all an anti-Pakistan operation. But we certainly, in the intelligence realm, I think we can work with India as a significant player and a significant partner. We have other important partners. Several of our Arab friends have very good intelligence assets directed against al-Qaeda. I'll just mention one, Jordan. Jordan has a long history of working against al-Qaeda. And in the coast bombing, of course, in 2009, it was 7 American officers who died. There was also a Jordanian intelligence officer who died, who was part of that operation trying to penetrate al-Qaeda for the purpose of finding a way to get to Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden. The Jordanians have been important partners, and I think they will continue to be. And we have other partners as well, who we can look to for assistance in this area. Our NATO partners have also been the target over the years of terrorist operations. The 2005 bombing in London had Ayman Zawahiri's name all over it. He produced the martyrdom videos of the bombers who carried out that operation. Our NATO allies were last year somewhat disappointed in the lack of consultations they got before the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think the good news on this front is the war in the Ukraine has brought NATO back together. We're more solidly united than ever. Of course, we have a major focus on Russia and Ukraine, but that doesn't mean we can't walk and chew gum at the same time. And certainly we should be looking to work closely with our NATO partners in the intelligence war against these various terrorist groups.
Phil, if you were asked to design the U.S. counterterrorism strategy going forward, what would you do? What would you recommend?
First off, I'd recommend that it have regular attention at the National Security Council and the deputies and principals meetings. That's the first thing you do, because it has to flow from the top down to the intelligence community, to the national security community, of the importance of this threat still. Despite the other challenges we do have, the Russia-Ukraine war, possible aggression from China, threats of a nuclear breakout by Iran, and this, but it has to be highlighted from the very top, from where policy is made at the White House, that this is still a threat to us that we will spend resources to deal with. Not as great as a threat as it was 2 decades ago, but it has not gone away. The second is we need allies. And as Bruce was giving a very good rundown about the nation states in the region that have helped us, traditionally helped us, and can help us. And he also, his earlier remarks about how it's a little bit even more difficult now than it was in 2001. The closest nation states to Afghanistan, first off, Pakistan and Iran are obviously no help whatsoever. The Central Asian states that border Afghanistan, with the exception of Tajikistan, which is threatened by the IMU offshoot Jamaat Ansarullah, have taken either a neutral or wait and see approach toward the Taliban, as opposed to the approach they took in the 2000 to 2001 time period. However, that is not immutable. And as intelligence professionals, we know that what is often on the surface is not what is actually going on beneath the surface. And with quiet diplomacy, without threatening these countries and possible retaliation, we may be able to convince them to provide us some sort of support. It doesn't have to be open, but it could be tangible. And we don't have to have them come out and declare themselves against the Taliban. But with time and operations like this show our seriousness about this problem. That is probably the most reassuring thing that you can do, and that you're willing to do it again if they will provide support. And then, as I mentioned before, we have natural allies within the country that are still resisting the Taliban. They're people we know literally, they're people we have trained, there are people who have an agenda that is something we can support. And if they were to be able to gain more territory in their native areas, this could help us, again, with intelligence collection, as well as expanding counterterrorism infrastructure, so that we could at least better identify, penetrate, and disrupt possible threats coming through out of Afghanistan. I'm not talking about large-scale projects as we've done in the past, but at the very least, talking to them, working with them, helping them unite. So as we did in 1981 with the various jihadi groups fighting against the Soviets, so that their efforts are directed against the Taliban and not against each other. So, and the divisiveness that sometimes exists between resistance groups. So these are the things that I would suggest in a national security policy against the counterterrorism threat coming from Afghanistan.
Thanks, Phil. Bruce, we have a 3-part question. First, who is the most likely successor as emir? Saif al-Abdel Abd al-Rahman al-Maghrebi, or another? 2, what is left of the collective leadership body, or shura, and if it still exists, who now comprises it, and how cohesive is it really? And finally, what is Sirajuddin Haqqani's relationship with ISK?
Those are excellent questions. And I will give my honest answer. On at least 2 of them, I don't know. Saif Adil has been the person most often mentioned as the likely successor. His whereabouts are believed to be in Afghanistan. He also spent some time in Iran, which is not all that unusual for al-Qaeda people. We don't have a lot of data on the leadership of al-Qaeda anymore, at least in the public domain, because we have been so good over the last 10 years in attacking the leadership of al-Qaeda. Not only did we get Osama bin Laden, and now we've got Ayman al-Zawahiri, but the drones have inflicted an enormous cost on the al-Qaeda leadership structure. And as a consequence, they've gone more and more deeper underground. Which gets to the question about the Shura Council. We know there's still a Shura Council, and there will be some body that elects, maybe selects is a better than word than elects, selects who the new Emir of al-Qaeda will be. But again, its activities are very mysterious. We don't know much about it. The prospects are that we will get some hardened veteran of al-Qaeda's years, who is probably very well known to the CIA and our friends around the world, but who may not be very well known in the public arena. One of the things that made Zawahiri was, as I said, he was a prolific author. If you Googled al-Qaeda, you were going to get his best hits, and many of them. In that sense, he's really quite unique. There aren't a lot of other al-Qaeda individuals or jihadist terrorists who are so vocal and public in going forward with their views.
Thanks, Bruce. One last question. What is Sirajuddin Haqqani's relationship with ISK?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe Phil
Okay,
does. I
that's
don't.
one of the don't knows. Phil, any?
If Bruce doesn't know, I certainly don't know. I would. I'd have to say that. I would, regarding that question, I'd take it another step. And not only the question is, we just discussed who's going to be replacing Zawahiri and the importance in that, but there's also a leadership debate that's going to be going on in the Taliban about their future direction. They've been caught. What are they going to do about it? Is there going to be pressure from the international community to make them do something about it? Also, I mean, this was a natural debate that as soon as they took power, that has to be going on now and has to be certainly accelerated with the events of the past week. Is the Taliban going to concentrate its efforts within Afghanistan, rebuilding its country, or by just the nature of its ideology, as I discussed earlier, is it going to try and spread jihad through Central Asia, or by harboring these two globally motivated groups, al-Qaeda and the Islamic, or they're not harboring them, but they have them in their country, Islamic State Khorasan province. Are they going to take a more global approach towards the jihad? It's almost the Russia expert in me kind of remembers it as the debate between Stalin about socialism in one country and Trotsky of spreading world revolution. Well, it's different ideology, but probably the same debate is going on right now in the Taliban leadership. And how this debate is settled is probably going to have even more of an impact than who becomes the leader of the al-Qaeda after Zawahiri, in my humble opinion.
Thanks. A question I'd like to ask you, Phil, and obviously protecting operational secrets and such. Could you comment a little bit on how the United States and how our counterterrorism community, the lengths they go to avoid innocence and collateral damage? I mean, this strike was breathtaking in that, from what is in the press, it just took out al-Zawahiri when there were other people sleeping close by. Can you just comment on that and what that means to planning a counterterrorism operation too?
Obviously, it makes the planning more difficult, but it's also, I think, very indicative of who we are. And it's a good burden to have when you look at it. And I've been on the National Security Council staff where we've been at the meetings and debating, and I've personally been frustrated at times at some of the high standards we've set. But in the light of day, when you go back and you look at it, these are the standards we should be setting within reason to make sure that we do not have more collateral damage than is absolutely necessary. This is also part of the law of land warfare. Two key parts are military necessity and proportionality. And we need to follow that because that's who we are as a nation. The other element in this to consider is it just makes it a longer process because you have to be absolutely sure. And as you would know, intelligence is an art as much as a science, and the interpreting of the data, which I mentioned it earlier before, can often be contradictory or vague or ambiguous, and turning that into intelligence, it makes that even harder and a longer process. We were helped out by Zawahiri himself, but he stayed put, apparently, according to press reports, for at least 6 months. That makes it a lot easier. If he was bedding down in a different place each night, and I bet the next head of al-Qaeda does so, that just magnifies the difficulty in conducting such operations, the gathering of intelligence, the analyzing it, and then conducting surveillance, even more so. And again, it brings me back to my, my main thesis here is we need allies against this threat, both around Afghanistan, as Bruce has pointed out, and internally inside of Afghanistan, as I've been stressing.
Yeah, I think we were all struck by how confident he was, that he felt he could stay in one place and go out on the balcony in the diplomatic, Shishi area of Kabul. Yeah, it really is pretty extraordinary.
He had a better view of Kabul where he was living than I did. The times. I lived in the city, and I know that neighborhood, and it's nice. I mean, it's in a view. It's basically within a view, and certainly within walking distance of our large American embassy.
Yeah.
So there was no mistake about what Sirajuddin Haqqani and the others were doing when they put him up there.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that was a very heavy security area too, if there were diplomatic facilities. Yeah,
absolutely.
Pretty shocking.
Again, and one wonders where the rest of them are.
Exactly. Bruce, we have another question. What do we know about MBS Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia? What do we know about his attitude towards and actions concerning previous well-known Wahhabi spiritual and financial support for al-Qaeda and Islamic State activities?
The Saudis in general took a very passive attitude towards al-Qaeda until the devil came home. In 2001 and 2002, we got limited support at best from the Saudis. Once al-Qaeda began striking, blowing up targets in Riyadh and Jeddah and other places, and basically turning Saudi Arabia into a battlefield in the middle of the first decade of this millennium, their attitude shifted. They then became much more supportive of fighting al-Qaeda and much more determined not to have an al-Qaeda presence in their country. They also were more supportive of allowing us to use Saudi facilities for operations against al-Qaeda in Yemen. It's a not very well kept secret that we've operated out of Saudi Arabia against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula for some time. Of course, the man who led this effort was not Mohammed bin Salman. It was his predecessor as Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Nayef, who has now been under detention for the last better than 2 years because he continues to be the de facto rival to MBS, MBN versus MBS. I think the big question mark about the Saudis always is, what are they doing to keep money from going to al-Qaeda and other groups? And that includes, by the way, the Taliban. The Taliban raises its money, its external source of money is primarily in the Gulf. And some of that is in Saudi Arabia, some of it's in the UAE, some of it's in Bahrain. And it's the flow of money where the Saudis and the Emiratis and others have been less zealous than they should be. And one of the things, if Joe Biden is now going to engage MBS on a regular basis, this should be a high priority issue, cutting down on the source of funds, not just for al-Qaeda, but for the Taliban. Saudi Arabia was one of only a handful of countries that recognized the Taliban government before 2001, along with Pakistan. We should be very clear with the Saudis now that we expect them to be firm in supporting the anti-Taliban pressure, particularly now that we've had this really blatant, in our face demonstration of the continued bonds between al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban official position today, Raleigh, is that they are, quote, investigating reports that he was killed. They're not denying that they had a relationship with him. They're not denying that he was there. They're, quote, investigating what's going on. This is pretty blatant. I will underscore the point that both you and Phil also met. This was a man who, for the better part of 3 decades, was on the run and was really good at it and showed incredible tradecraft in hiding. And apparently 6 months ago, he said, at the end of that, I'm just going out on the balcony and taking in the view and having his family with him. This is, he stopped using the tradecraft that had kept him alive for 30 years because he was obviously convinced that he was as safe as could be in that safe house.
Yeah, it's like the band's back together. It's really crazy.
Yeah.
Final question for both of you. This was a pretty spectacular attack on al-Zawahiri. Do you think there's going to be some sort of retaliation by either organized or, the sort of lone wolves who will be inspired by, his death and angered at the United States? Do you think there possibility of increased attacks on the homeland, again, potentially lone wolf kind of things, or against, for instance, our embassies around the world?
Raleigh, I'll first off, we would not know at this point, just from open source information, we would assume so, but I say it's immaterial. The whole purpose of al-Qaeda is to strike at us as the far enemy. It's in their core belief. They are against our basic interest, and they have time and time again used lethal operations against us. So whether they're thinking of retaliating or not because of this one particular incident may be a distinction without a difference, since their whole purpose of being is to strike us at us when they can.
Okay. Bruce, anything to add?
I think that's right. That is their purpose. There will be, without question, those pushing for retaliation. The United States in the last 20 years has become a much harder target than it used to be. And we have a much more sophisticated and interactive counterterrorism capability. We now have screening mechanisms that we didn't even dream of 20 years ago. And I would also underscore Phil's point. It is vital that the president and the White House continue to be deeply involved in bringing together the national security bureaucracy to force everyone to come to the table and tell people what it is they know. One of the reasons that 2001 9/11 happened was because we didn't have a principals meeting on al-Qaeda in the first 9 months of the Bush administration, and there was no bringing everyone together to have discussions. We need to have that. And I would say that because of the threat of retaliation from lone wolves or whatever, this is a particularly important time to be having those kind of meetings. I'll say one last thing. A tempting target for any kind of retaliation will, of course, be the country which hosted the base from which these drones flew. They may not be able to strike in the United States, but if they could go after the base or an embassy of the country that hosted it, that would be a very important way of them saying, see, you work with the Americans and you're going to pay a price. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see if something like that happens in the next several months or so.
Thank you to you both. Our time has come to an end. A fascinating discussion. I think it'd be good to get you back maybe in 6 or 9 months to continue this conversation on where counterterrorism is going. Before I close, I'd like to say thank you to our supporters and members and our participants this morning. And thank you to those of you who asked questions. We had some really excellent questions this morning. I'd also like to put in a plug we are doing a 3-part Africa series. 2 of them we have already done, but the 3rd one is this coming Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. That will be chaired by Ambassador Charles Ray, who is the chair of our Africa program. And that's this Tuesday at 10 p.m. Or 10 a.m., excuse me, 10 a.m. The previous 2 programs are on our YouTube channel, so you can watch them. The first one was on violent extremism in Africa. The second one, this past Tuesday, was a discussion of the current situation and implications in Ethiopia and Tigray. And the program this coming Tuesday is on the Kenyan elections, which are actually going on August 9th, which is this coming Tuesday. But because of the time difference, I think we'll have ample material for comment on those elections. So again, thank you very much for coming. Thank you to our panelists. Very grateful to you both for really, really insightful and interesting comments this morning. Take care and thank you.
Thank you, Raleigh.
Thank you.